He drove a black hearse. It was a Cadillac hearse, but it was clearly identifiable as a hearse. It was an older hearse, probably a 55 or 56, I can't remember now which. Anyway, he drove it and he wore a silk top hat and was self-identified as a hippie. He came into Boulder with the musicians and the others with alternative views, alternative lifestyles, and alternative images, including clothing. In any event, the police associated these costumes and the attire in general of young people, particularly associated with black hair or long hair, I guess not black hair, long hair, with drugs, particularly marijuana. So the assumption was if somebody was driving around in a weird vehicle or a painted hippie van with flowers on it or something like this, or anything alternative that didn't look normal, they would pull the vehicle over, and with that act, coupled with the assumption that they would find drugs, they went on a large-scale arrest program, which later would become known as profiling. So if you had long hair, you had an alternative vehicle that had alternative decorations, that had license plates from out of town, then you could pull the vehicle over and more than likely find drugs, or at least that was the common wisdom. Unbeknownst at that time, you would also probably find some rich kids from back east whose parents had lots of money to fight drug charges, but that was later than in the 60s and early 70s. Anyway, this client got pulled over, and they pulled him out of the vehicle, searched him, patted him down, searched him some more, had his pockets turned inside out, and when they found no drugs on him, they turned to the vehicle. And behind the passenger's front seat, they found 3 seeds. They picked up the seeds, put them in an evidence envelope, labeled them, and opened a case against the driver of the vehicle. It wasn't a working ambulance, it was just an ambulance. I think it had Mississippi plates or something like that. In any event, they charged him with possession of marijuana. Now, at that time, they were charging small amounts of marijuana, planting small amounts of marijuana, whatever. The judges weren't sophisticated enough, or most of them had been ex-prosecutors, and it wouldn't occur to them that the drugs had been planted or in some other manner or fashion not amenable to prosecution. In any event, they arrested this guy and held him for possession of marijuana, but because they were seeds, they added a charge of cultivation, which was a larger penalty, because what else would you do with seeds? You can't smoke them. The only thing you can do with a marijuana seed is plant it, nurture it, water it, and let it grow into a plant. And then if the plant matures, you can smoke the product and it becomes marijuana. So that justified the charge, I guess, of cultivation. Anyway, this type of stuff had gone on for a while, and rather than play the game of cops and robbers that's generally played, I decided to file a writ of habeas corpus, and that would cause the sheriff to have to go to court to show why he was holding this guy. My position was, until you knew something more, just the mere possession of seeds wasn't a crime, and I wanted to know what the prosecutor's theory was. Well, they didn't quite know how to handle habeas corpus then, because this was a new DA, and the old DA had probably had some, but in the meantime, they abolished common law in Colorado and went to a Napoleonic code or criminal code, and the writs weren't really specifically mentioned. So there was all kinds of confusion, and finally there was some case law came down that they had to germinate the seeds to make sure they were marijuana, and they had to germinate them and grow them, etc. Well, the one guy in the DA's office caught a little razzing over that. His name was Bob Jenkins, and Jenkins then decided to take the writ personally, and he and a guy named Bill Gray filed a grievance against me for misuse of habeas corpus. I don't know if it was formally filed or whatever, but I remember there was a bunch of debate about that. In any event, they dropped the case. What was the motivation for me filing that was the fact that I had many cases where there really wasn't any probable cause to have pulled over a vehicle, other than the fact the driver had long hair, he had an out-of-state vehicle tag, and there was data to suppose the supposition that people with long hair typically smoked dope, and if they were smoking dope, they typically had some located on their premises, on their person, or in their vehicles. So the odds of arrest were pretty good. The odds of getting past a suppression motion were decent, although the judges got pretty wary and sophisticated when it came to that type of probable cause for searches. Anyway, that was some of the weird cases I had at the beginning. Another one was a guy in Greeley. He was a student at CSU, and his father hired me to defend his son. Interestingly enough, the father was an intelligence agent for the Internal Revenue Service. In other words, he did the criminal prosecutions. He was a criminal investigator. What had happened there was his son was driving in Fort Collins. He was a student there. He did a Hollywood stop, allegedly, at a stop sign, and the cops noticed him and decided to pull him over, probably because he was young, and it's a college town, and they like to roust young people in college towns. In any event, they tried to pull him over, and what he did is he had something, and he put it in his mouth and started chewing on it and eating it. The cop dragged him out of the chair, got him in a headlock, and took a napkin from somewhere and dabbed it on the guy's teeth and took out a flake of something from his mouth, from the tooth, and entered it into evidence. It looked like a marijuana flake. They assumed he was smoking marijuana. That's why they pulled him over, because it didn't look like an ordinary cigarette. And since he tried to swallow the alleged evidence, they forcefully did the equivalent of a search, a warrantless search, non-probable cause search. In any event, DAs back then were really anxious to show the voting public that they were pro-law and order, anti-war, anti-hippie, and anti-dissent, essentially. And particularly the DAs up in Weld County, which was fairly corrupt. And they produced a famous district attorney, later congressman, named Buck, who was ultra-conservative, etc. In any event, I filed some motions, and I wanted them to turn over the evidence to my toxicologist for analysis. Now, there was another thing going on in the drug enforcement days, in those days, and that was, how do you define marijuana? Well, marijuana was statutorily described in a federal statute talking about a botanical classification of cannabis indica. And cannabis indica was specifically defined and differentiated from cannabis ruderalis and cannabis, well, it was cannabis sativa. And there was cannabis indica and cannabis ruderalis. And it was specified that it had to be cannabis sativa L. Well, they delegated some of the defining capabilities or prerogatives to an administrative review board with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, later the DEA. Before that was Revenue Department, I think, or Internal Revenue Service. In any event, somehow the idea that there was a psychoactive ingredient called THC, I'm sorry. A 50-year-old memory sometimes doesn't come back quite as readily. So somehow in the course of various cases, it became a folklore or a moray that marijuana, for the sake of prosecution, meant something containing THC, which some of us pointed out constantly, but it didn't seem to matter because the judiciary read somewhere that THC was a psychoactive drug, and rather than rewrite the drug laws, they just decided that's what it was really meant when people mentioned marijuana. In any event, there wasn't enough on the flake on the guy's tooth to send it to an independent pharmacologist or whatever, agronomist, chemist, to form a test, or to perform a test to determine whether or not it had THC or tetrahydrocannabinol. And they had to dismiss the case. But those were some of the diminutive cases that we had here. The ones I had in Nebraska were almost as silly. There was one case where a black lady was driving a Lincoln, and the cop there assumed that no black person would drive a fancy car like that unless that person were either a prostitute or dealing drugs. So the police, or the actually state patrolman out of Ogallala, pulled her over and searched the glove compartment and found a tiny bit of heroin in there and charged her with interstate transportation of heroin. No probable cause to believe there's heroin other than the color of the lady and the fancy car. Later cases that I had in Nebraska indicated that they were getting tipped off. The Highway Patrol was getting tipped off when marijuana was coming out of Nevada, generally in Las Vegas, and they'd wait for the car and pull the car over and arrest the person, shake him down, take the weed, take the marijuana, send it back to Nevada to be reshipped. There were several cases where this was done, and two of them that I had involved a group of corrupt police officials in the State Patrol and Sheriff's Department that belonged to a group called the Company, which consisted of law enforcement officers and agents of the DEA and Central Intelligence Agency. They operated out of Nebraska. They operated a racket there. They got caught and prosecuted, and as soon as they changed shifts with new personnel, they were up to the same shenanigans later. There was a couple other little scams that the police in Nebraska ran, but I'll go into later, such as selling fake maps for marijuana grows to bikers so they could arrest them, and various other things like that. But these are going to be different stories. Another different story would be the case where I discovered they were packing heroin in the corpses out of Vietnam and shipped it from Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base to Travis Air Force Base to Albuquerque, double bases there, Sandia and Kirtland, up the San Luis Valley into Pueblo for distribution to points east. And in the 60s, Pueblo was pretty much a heroin hub. But again, that's a different matter. I could also tell stories of the cocaine trafficking led by the CIA. One of the reasons that I know so much about this is my younger brother was with a group called Blue Light, and I think you people could look that up. They were the 20th Special Operations Unit that he was with, and they flew helicopters, and later they became, well, they were known mainly as the Green Hornets, and the Green Hornets formed a group called Blue Light that was counter-terrorist, and Blue Light got in a pissing contest with the Army, and you had the Green Berets in competition, you had Colonel Beckwith's group in competition, General Secord and General Singlaub in competition with each other, and a big fight over who was going to be the honcho for terrorism, which at that time when they were doing all this led me to believe that maybe we were going to start having a problem with terrorists in order to justify continuing the Pentagon's budget and things like this, because there weren't too many incidences of terrorism at that time. Although my opponent at DA mentioned the fact that terrorism was going to be the big thing later on, and that election was in 1972, so it took a while for that to build. But they did build a whole industry based on terrorism and counterterrorism, which I'm not confident really was necessary, but I'm also thinking it was a good PR thing in a way of spending money and justifying budgets. But that's just my bullshit theories. I will tell you that Blue Light got moved to NATO, and I asked my brother one time while they were moved to a different jurisdiction, not under the Pentagon, and he told me that it was awkward when a unit had to investigate their own when they were both operating under the Pentagon. So I'll let you people imagine or determine what that meant. It meant one thing to me, but I've got a different history, I guess. So I'm rambling now, and I apologize. I should go back to the 60s, but it's interesting. I've been watching the shenanigans of the federal agencies for 50 years now, and even though the players change, the shenanigans don't. Now, a lot of people out there would suggest that I'm setting forth conspiracy theories. I'm not. I'm a sociologist. I'm a trained observer. I view myself as a scientist. And I'll give you a few good reasons that I'm not a conspiracy theorist. First off, in 1968, I identified certain people that were working for the government involved in drug operations. I had two mafia clients that worked for Jack Ruby when Jack Ruby was with Army Intelligence. They were arming Castro and Batista, both. They were also smuggling heroin out of the Caribbean in armored bank cars up through Mexico across the border in the United States. I've had other instances with clients tell me the same thing. Toward the end of my career, many of my criminal drug clients were also contract agents or former employees of the Central Intelligence Agency. What I will say is I identified people in 1968 that were involved with the government and with the drug trade. Now, those people are either dead or retired now. People like Turple and Wilson that were involved, they're gone. But the activities stay. 1968, I identified the company and drug trade out of Nebraska. And it was years later, I ran across a strange same group with different players doing the same thing, busting people on the interstate highway near North Platte, Ogallala segment, and shipping it back to Las Vegas and reselling, and using the money to fund various operations. So in 1978 or so, I proposed an amendment or a statute which said that all forfeitures or revenues or property obtained by any governmental agency should be turned over to the general fund and appropriated by Congress. So you could make these people self-funding. One of the things I noticed from the CIA is they became self-funding to places like Air America and a lot of the proprietaries. We can't have that. If we want to control our agencies, if we want to control our government, we need to control their funding. We can't let them raise money by themselves. So because of this, and because of the pressure on the war, because of policy, and because Congress didn't have the wherewithal or the balls to declare a war, they were fought illegally, and along with the illegal fighting of the war became the illegal drug trade and other ramifications. I think a book called Politics of Heroin of Southeast Asia and its subsequent editions written by a guy named McCoy spells it out pretty well, and he traces the history. There are other books that trace the history even better, but we seem to forget about who we are, how our government works, and what the government is for. It surely isn't for dealing drugs, poisoning people, for keeping veterans out of the United States because they become addicted to CIA heroin, to encourage our veterans to come back to the United States and deal drugs because they got used to it in Vietnam. That's not what we are, that's not what we stand for, and we shouldn't put up with that shit. And it's time that people started knowing about this, and knowing about it doesn't do any good unless people are discussing it. And until we get a population that has the degree of outrage that I've had the last 50 years, we're not going to have anything done anyway. And rather than have all these people attacking me as being a radical, which I'm not, or being a nutcase, which I probably am, but I'm not that kind of nutcase, or being a conspiracy theorist, I say to hell with you. I say read, look into things, start thinking, start questioning, start observing, and quit falling for the propaganda that the government's putting out. And start thinking for yourselves, and start organizing, and start demanding that our government become our government and not a corporate government, that they represent the people, that they don't have the ability to raise their own funding and money in order to hurt the people, and quit following the propaganda line. Now, I hope a lot of you at least attempt to attack me on the comments part of this, or maybe you can support me. I don't care. What I don't like is the fact that nobody's commenting. Not many people are acknowledging anything. I would like to have a lot of people in comments say go to hell, or say blew it, you're a nutcase, or keep up the good work, or anything in between. Ignoring what I say is not a viable option as far as I'm concerned. So enjoy your weekends, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching.